Hey, seventh grade, it's Mr. Friday. Just checking in with you guys, sending our weekly video update, a review of what we've been doing this week. We'll get into some of our notes from chapters 97 and 98, and hopefully this is a good reference for you to hear directly from me what some of the points of emphasis are for the week. Just reviewing, though, some of the work you've been doing. Thank you to everyone who took the quiz online earlier this week. I think that tool was pretty useful, and everything seemed to go pretty smoothly there. Um, Overall, if you have any questions about how you did on the quiz or anything like that, just let me know. I'd love to follow up with you guys and hear what you thought about it. So if you want to send me an email, give me a call, just do that anytime you'd like. So I'm here to help. A couple of other things before we get into the review of our class notes. As you're doing assignments, you may see different grades and whatnot. Uh, 100, a 90, an 80, it could be a 50, whatever. I just want to give you a little feedback on what that means. It certainly doesn't mean I think you're being lazy. It could be something where a 50 might be you turned in half of an assignment. Maybe I believe there have been a couple of occasions where people haven't turned in all of the questions that were assigned, or maybe they were only able to upload part of the assignment. So if you find a grade missing like that, especially something like a 50, that would mean I'm missing half of the work. If it's something more along the lines of an 80 or a 90, that feedback is just to let you know maybe you're skipping questions. That happened on several occasions. People just putting a question mark if they had a hard time on a question. Rather than doing that, I'd rather have you just send me an email or reach out to me so I can help you with that question or dig through your book, use your Bible to learn that material. That's really what these assignments are about. We don't get to be together in class every day. And so the best way to keep up with everything and to actually learn these passages is to do that work and do it thoughtfully. So there have been some examples of people turning in work that just seemed really rushed, didn't seem to put a lot of effort into it. And so you might have seen a couple of points taken off there. But for the most part, everybody's doing a great job. If there is something marked as missing, just take note of that and make sure you turn it in. Once I receive it, I'll take away the missing and put in your grade that you've earned. So overall, we still have our participation category grades and our coursework grades, our quiz grades. We'll have tests later in the quarters as well. But some of those assignments fall under each of those categories. So I don't know what you're doing every day in your homes. I know you guys have been working hard and you've done a good job making the transition. So when I do receive those assignments, I read through them to make sure that you're uh, really trying to learn, and that's what those scores have been based on. Well, with all that said, let's just jump into the material that we've been looking at this week with chapter 97 and 98. This is a big turning point in Paul's ministry, really in his whole life, because the third missionary journey comes to an end. And as you may have seen at the end of chapter 97 and the beginning of chapter 98, Paul is arrested. He's arrested at the temple in Jerusalem. And a little spoiler alert is he's never given freedom from that point ever again. The rest of his life, he spends in some form of arrest or another in custody. So that's what we'll be studying really as we continue wrapping up the book of Acts. We'll do that over the next few weeks, and then we'll look at some other books in the New Testament as the school year wraps up. I hope we'll be back together in class, in person by then. I did see even just earlier today, the governor extended the length that the public schools will be out. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from Covenant. I know Dr. Arnold just sent a message yesterday that he extended Covenant's uh, time away from school till the 13th. They may review that and push it to match the state deadline. We'll see. So just stay tuned and keep working online as you're able to. So getting into chapter 97, Let me go ahead now and pull those notes up for you, where you can see them too. That third journey is ending. And you might remember Paul had left Macedonia and Achaia. He had picked up the collection. He was going to deliver it to Jerusalem. So that's where he's going. And this was a long journey. He's trying to get to Jerusalem by Passover, or I'm sorry, by Pentecost, which is 50 days after Passover. And we saw what happened in Troas, where Eutychus fell out the window. We saw what happened in Miletus when he met with the Ephesian elders. And then the rest of the way there, let me pull this up where you can see the map below us. Paul received several warnings. And you read about that in your book and in your Bible, but those warnings were serious. People were telling him, don't go on, don't go to Jerusalem, you're going to be arrested. Uh, these terrible things are awaiting you. And it really brings up the question of why did he continue? And that's what I want you to know here, on top of what the warnings actually were, but why would he go on in the face of that? Well, first of all, these warnings weren't really commands from God to stop. If God had commanded him to stop, Paul would have obeyed and stopped. Uh, Even the believers, after Paul insisted that he was going to continue on, those believers, I believe the book of Acts says that they trusted in the Lord's will as Paul traveled on to Jerusalem. And so Paul put his faith that uh, God had a plan for him. God had a purpose for him to visit Jerusalem, even if it meant that he was going to suffer. And of course, don't forget his main motivation in going to Jerusalem was to deliver that collection, to deliver the gift that they really needed. They needed the support. The believers in Jerusalem were heavily persecuted, they were poor, and so Paul was going to support the church in Jerusalem. So he goes on, in spite of all of those warnings, even Agabus the prophet, that one might stand out the most. I believe that was in Caesarea, where Agabus acted out Paul's arrest. He took his garment belt and tied up Paul's hands and said, "This is what's going to happen. You're going to be tied up and imprisoned if you go to Jerusalem." So he did go on. When he arrived in Jerusalem, there's an interesting conversation between Paul and other church leaders. And most notably, it's James, the brother of Jesus, who had become probably the most prominent church leader in Jerusalem at that time. He sits down with Paul. Of course, they're all well aware that there's danger in Jerusalem for Paul. There's been rumors, all the Jews had been spreading the news that everywhere Paul goes, he's telling people to stop obeying God's law. And this would just sound like the worst thing in the world to a Jewish believer. Even someone who was a Christian, they still had been raised following those Jewish ceremonies and customs, and this would sound pretty radical. And of course, Paul had been ministering among the Gentiles. Paul had been preaching and teaching that those ceremonies were not required for Gentile believers, but he certainly wasn't uh, condemning those who did still follow the Jewish ceremonies. We don't put our hope and faith in keeping the law or doing X, Y, or Z for salvation, but they were certainly able to continue worshiping God at the temple in Jerusalem. And so they came up with a plan, or here in your notes, called the plot. I think that's the way it was referred to in the book. And the believers, the church in Jerusalem said, well, Paul, maybe we can just prove to all of your naysayers that you don't really have a problem with temple worship. You don't really have a problem with the Mosaic law. And so they had four men who had taken a vow, a Nazirite vow. You might think back to the Old Testament, like Samson was a Nazirite, not cutting the hair or drinking wine and other things they had done. And these men, their vow was almost complete. So they were going to go to the temple. There was a ceremony involved, and even someone would sponsor them and bring an offering for these men to the temple. And so the plan was, Paul, you go be their sponsor. This will be you putting your stamp of approval on their Nazirite vow, which was one of the Old Testament ceremonies, and then we'll prove to everyone that these rumors about you aren't really true. So Paul agreed which may seem a little strange. I mean, he had been pretty bold to guard salvation by grace through faith alone, right? He had been very bold about making sure the Gentiles were accepted by faith alone and not having to keep the laws. And this could have sent some mixed messages, but you see here in the notes, Paul wanted to be all things to all people. Paul, in wisdom, continued on supporting these men to show the Jewish believers around him that he wasn't causing an offense, that he really did support their heartfelt worship of God, and that they were saved by faith the same way the Gentiles were. So he's trying to remove those obstacles. Well, as it turns out, the plan falls apart. Almost as soon as it came together, Paul goes to the temple, and earlier in the day, there was a man named Trophimus, one of the Gentiles from Ephesus who had come with Paul. Uh, they had been together in Jerusalem, and people saw them together. And when Paul went to the temple, some of the Jews just assumed that Trophimus came to the temple with Paul. He wasn't really there, but this was a big deal. For a Gentile to enter the temple was basically desecrating the temple. It was making the entire temple unclean. And so there were plaques outside the temple. If any Gentile enters this place, it's punishable by death. So this was, a terrible accusation that Paul had defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile there. Of course, he didn't even really do that. But pure chaos erupts. Everyone's screaming and yelling. They're angry with Paul. And the only thing that saves Paul in the moment is the Roman soldiers were on high alert, and the Roman soldiers came in, stopped the outburst, and arrested Paul and started to drag him off. That's where chapter 98 picks up. Right, we're right in the middle of Acts 21, and here, in the midst of all this chaos and confusion, Paul gets to speak to the crowd. He talks to the Roman, he speaks Greek to the Roman soldier, and then he speaks Hebrew to the crowd, which shows us another aspect of what this lesson is really all about, is how we can use wisdom in our words and the way we speak to people so that we can be all things to all people, like Paul was doing. He was trying not to offend the Jews. He's trying not to offend the Roman soldiers. He's trying not to offend the crowd. But at the same time, he speaks the truth to them. So you'll see in your notes here, and as you read on through chapter 98, some of the ways that Paul tried to identify with the crowd. He speaks Hebrew to them, which, by the way, the Romans didn't understand what he was saying completely to the crowd. He told them about his background as a Pharisee, how he was taught by Gamaliel, how he was a persecutor. He used Jewish terminology that they would have been in line with themselves. So he was doing everything he could to connect with that crowd so that they would listen to him. And then he talked about his conversion. He talked about being on the road to Damascus, how he saw the risen Jesus. All the way through that, there's no reaction, there's no anger. But when he finally points to his calling to preach to the Gentiles, the crowd loses it again. The riot breaks out again. People are throwing dirt in the air. It's like a little baby having a temper tantrum, and the crowd is outraged. And imagine being the Roman soldiers here, right? They don't know what's going on. All these people are speaking Hebrew. It's not their native language. They just know everybody's angry. So they take Paul away to send him into an inner prison, into these barracks, and they're going to beat him to find out what's going on. Well, if you've read that chapter and that passage, we know here's another case where Paul used wisdom. He used his legal rights as a Roman citizen to protect him from that beating. And so he had a right to a fair trial. He brings it up to them as they're just about to start whipping him. And so they schedule a trial with the Sanhedrin next. So that's a review. The big theme there for us is just noting how Paul faced that persecution, how Paul faced an unbelieving world around him, how he sought to identify with those people, how he tried everything he could not to cause an offense, but he was strong and he was committed to the gospel, and he did speak the truth in love to them. So we'll read on more next week about what would happen in that trial. But take care until then and keep up the good work.